Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. Thank you very much for being here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Almudena Garcia, and I'm Communications and Learning Officer at ICI. And I'll be stepping in today to moderate today's webinar, where we'll be discussing the potential of landscape approaches to tackle child labor. So, as probably many of you know, landscape approaches have increasingly gained popularity as a promising as a promising approach to address sustainability challenges in the cocoa sector, with ICI and many of our partners starting to pilot projects at a landscape scale to tackle child labor. So when we started our project, we weren't aware of other projects, of other landscape approaches that had effectively addressed child labor. This is why we wanted to commission a study that is being launched today to identify 6 case studies of landscape approaches that aimed to tackle child labor. And we wanted to analyze their... I'm just going to unmute. Apologies for these technical issues. So as I was saying, we commissioned a study to identify 6 case studies of landscape approaches that aim to tackle child labor, and we wanted to analyze their effectiveness at preventing and addressing child labor. So this report is now publicly available on our website, and shortly we will hear an overview of the report findings by Lisa de Graaf, one of the authors of this study. We will then have a panel discussion with a great lineup of panelists, and then we will have some time for questions and answers. So before we get started, some housekeeping rules. As you may have noticed, this webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded onto our YouTube channel in case you want to have a look at that after the webinar. Please feel free to ask any questions at any point during the webinar in the Q&A section for any clarification, or if you want one of our panelists to delve into more detail. And then, of course, during the discussion, please feel free to raise your hand to ask any question, and I will unmute you. And please take into consideration that you can ask questions either in English or in French. And for those who are following us from a Francophone country, you can follow the webinar using live closed captions as indicated in the screenshots in the presentation. And you'll be able to translate the live captions into French, or you can follow them in English if that's of any help. You can also translate the slides into French. Again, follow the instructions in the slide here, so you can translate those slides. Of course, if you have any questions, any technical difficulties, please feel free to ask a question to either me or Megan, and we'll be happy to help. So let's start by getting to know our amazing panelists. I'll let them introduce themselves. Lisa, would you like to go first?
Yes, thank you so much, Almudena, for the introduction. My name is Lisa de Graaf. I am an Impact Economics Advisor at KIP Institute in Amsterdam. Oh, sorry, was someone? No, okay. I've been working on several projects related to agriculture, but also specifically focusing on child labor. And of course, one of the authors last year for the potentials of landscape approaches for child labor. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Gazel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Almudena. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I am Ghazal Malik. I'm the Program and Advocacy Manager at Global March Against Child Labor. I oversee programs that essentially focus on addressing child labor primarily in agriculture. And I have been working along with my team members at Global March Against Child Labor and are implementing partners in different countries on the area-based approach, which is also very similar to the landscape approach to address child labor, and looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you very much. Billy, would you like to go next?
Yes, hi everyone, and lovely to be here. So I'm Billy Wilcox-Brooke, an Associate Manager for Innovations at ITIL, based in London, and I lead our work on landscape and jurisdictional approaches, which includes convening a group of about 20 landscape practitioner organisations to align around good practice. So I'm very much coming into the conversation from the landscape and jurisdictional approaches perspective, and it's great to be learning specifically around the topic of child labour. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. And last but not least, Prince, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you. And thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Prince Jenfi. I'm with International Cocoa Initiative as Deputy Country Director for Ghana and Programs Coordinator. I've worked on the child labor space for the past 13 years, and I also led the implementation of ICI Landscape Pilot Project in Ghana, which we started in 2019. And I'm happy to join you and to give more perspective on the landscape practical approaches and how it works in Ghana. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all, and thanks so much for being here today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So Lisa, as you mentioned, you worked on the compilation of the series of case studies. Can you walk us through the method you used to identify the relevant examples and give us an overview of what you found, please?
Yes, thank you so much. If it's okay, I will now share my screen and start this presentation. Please confirm with me if you see everything correctly.
Yes, we see it just fine.
See your
Thank
screen.
you.
Great. Thank you so much for confirming. So, yes, welcome everyone. I will be presenting the potentials of landscape approaches for addressing child labor, where we draw learnings from various case studies. So this is a report that me and my colleagues wrote for ICI last year, as Almudena already shared, after landscape approaches gained more and more traction from development programs. So I will walk you through our research objectives, how we selected case studies, the methods that we used, and then I will show you the challenges that we've encountered and what we can learn from, but also good practices and then overall potentials that we see for landscape approaches to address child labor. So when we started off, of course, our first question was what examples of landscape initiatives are out there globally, but specifically in the West African region, which have integrated measures to tackle child labor. And of course, what can we learn from these case studies about effective coverage, thematic scope, type of interventions, coordinations, etc. But of course, also what to avoid and what challenges to expect. But first, for us, it was very important to start with what we define as a landscape, to really understand what a landscape approach means. So for us, in this report, a landscape is a social and ecological system, which essentially contains two layers. On one side, you have this socio-economic system, that contain you and me, education, economics, politics, and so on. But you also have the geo-ecological layer, which really includes biodiversity, water flow, the more ecological matters of a landscape. And then the landscape as a whole has these two layers interact and are influenced by internal and external influences. And then so for us, a landscape approach is really an approach that aims to resolve certain issues by taking into account the interconnectivity and interaction of all these different stakeholders within these two layers. It is implemented within a certain geographical area, but it is planned really beyond a specific time frame of a program. So it is really aims for long-term and sustainable impact. So after a first round of looking at what case studies were out there, we saw that there are essentially two types of approaches often used. So we have landscape approaches, and we saw that there are a lot of programs that use integrated area-based approaches. And for us, we wanted to see, okay, where then lies this difference? And we saw that a landscape approach, a traditional landscape approach, mostly has a primary focus on issues in the geo-ecological layer. So these programs more often tackle deforestation, land degradation, or water quality. And because of the focus in this geo-ecological layer, these programs always create this interaction between the socio-economical system and this geo-ecological system. Whereas an integrated area-based approach more has a primary focus on social issues. So have, in our case, child labor, education, or gender equality. And because of this, it does not necessarily always integrate the geo-ecological system in the program. But of course, because we focus on child labor, we've also used these types of approaches or cases in our study. So we selected case studies based on relevance regarding geographical focus, commodity of focus, to what extent they've integrated child labor, but of course also the availability of documents, and ideally it didn't end more than 5 years ago. So we really started off with ideally case studies that focused on cocoa growing regions, had a primary focus on child labor in West Africa. But we also planned that when we could not find these, we could diverge to different crops or diverge geographically. But eventually, our research includes 6 final case studies, which we've divided between 3 landscape approaches and 3 integrated area-based approaches. So these 3 landscape approaches, they are all located in West Africa, and they all focus on cocoa growing regions. And all of them also have in common that deforestation is their primary focus of issue. And then we have 3 integrated area-based approaches, of which 2 are also located in West Africa, one in Ghana, one in Côte d'Ivoire, and who focus on cocoa growing regions, and one last case study that is located in Eastern Africa and focuses on coffee growing regions. And these integrated area-based approaches do all have a primary focus on child labor. So methodologically, what we did, we divided these projects into different segments of interest. So we really looked at how these programs convened their stakeholders, how their governance was set up, and how their coordination is managed. We looked at financial management, how the activities were implemented and designed, but also if there was already any effectiveness. And of course, we looked at the sustainability of these programs. And we did so by conducting a literature review of relevant documents from the program, particularly focusing on good practices and challenges, which were supported by interviews with different relevant stakeholders and a focus group discussion. We had minimum of 1 interview per case, a maximum of 3. And the structure of these interviews roughly followed these different segments. But overall, the interviewers, the people that we interviewed really ranged from research staff to representatives of international institutes, of private sectors, but also really representatives of local community or farmer groups. So there was really a wide representation of stakeholders that we were able to interview. So starting off with the challenges that we saw that people encountered during the implementation. And I think we saw several challenges that were related to this approach specifically, while others were inevitably linked to development programs as a whole, the latter of which has some elements take a long time to fix. Think about improving the quality of teachers, setting up social protection systems, or addressing cultural norms and practices. Capacity, it was a resurrecting challenge. Think about capacity in the form of knowledge, but also resources, both human and financial. And then another issue that we often heard of was physical infrastructure, which is really an indirect link, which was classified as an indirect link to child labor, and therefore also often an overlooked element in many of these programs. But then if we look to the challenges that are related to the approach, I would say the first one is time. So implementing a landscape approach really requires long-term planning, which is for large elements linked to setting up a solid governance structure. This is a complex process. There are many stakeholders in a certain area that need to be included and coordinated. So this element is requiring a lot of time and can be money intensive. And that brings me to funding and financial management. We see that there's not yet a real clear silver bullet in financial mechanisms. So that might also be difficult to still set up. And then lastly, in terms of monitoring and evaluation, because there's an entire landscape involved, econometrically correctly evaluating can be challenging. So then we go to the good practices, and I will go through each of these different segments of interest that we looked into. So starting off with the convening of stakeholders. As I said, this can be a complex process, so it should be done comprehensively and should be planned realistically. But all stakeholders should be included, and this also includes stakeholders from this geo-ecological layer, because oftentimes elements that come from this do have a direct or indirect influence on child labor. Think of productivity of a farm, biodiversity, water quality. But when you do so, we saw that many, which was a good practice, is that many really convened already existing initiatives in a landscape, which can really help to improve landscape coherence, but it can also help to create synergies, where different type of interventions who normally could maybe never spoke to each other can at some point really leverage on each other's initiatives. And simultaneously, it can reduce the intervention fatigue while you also avoid to reinvent the wheel of creating new interventions. If done correctly, we also saw that it can really reduce the transfer of child labor between sectors or between commodities. But simultaneously, we saw that forgotten stakeholders could still perpetuate on the use of child labor. But overall, it allows for really an effective intervention that represents local contexts. So when we look at governance, we saw that it is important to really institutionalize your agreements, particularly if you have a complex area with many stakeholders. And therefore, it is important to invest in local stakeholders, but also to invest in local public authorities, because these stakeholders have the authority to enforce laws, but of course they are also the perennial organization. So when a program stops, there's not necessarily all of a sudden a gap that forms in this area. So it really ensures the continuity beyond the program. But if we look at how this structure is set up, it is really important to, from the beginning, invest in a solid governance structure. So which represents all stakeholders and ensures equity in decision making. And oftentimes we saw that in this process, there was a neutral entity involved, for example, which could be important when you look at competitors in the private sector. So there's really a natural element that allows, as a broker, to act in this. This ensures the adaptability of decisions from the top down, but it also ensures of communication from really different actors from the bottom up. And then, of course, we saw that it is important to respect traditional authorities, so that really there's an improvement of the recognition of these programs among local communities. So when we look at the setting of objectives and the design of interventions, good practices that we saw is that it is important to act holistically. So focusing both on direct and indirect causes to child labor, because a lot of these influences on child labor are interconnected as well. And as I already mentioned in the beginning, because a landscape approach has potential to convene different stakeholders, it is a good practice to not reinvent the wheel. So you can use existing initiatives in the area, and where there are gaps, you can fill these in by possibly implementing other initiatives. And when you start intervening here, we saw that it is good to address certain root causes simultaneously to really allow the results of this to leverage on each other. And then lastly, on interventions to really intervene on different levels. So you start off, of course, at a household level, but also work your way up, involve an entire community, even to the extent that there is some form of representation at the national level, for example, to allow for lobbying for a particular program. Well, looking at financial management, we see that there's not, as I mentioned, there's not yet a silver bullet to what should be used. We saw an example where there was some pooled funding, which allows for proportional contributions and then avoids the discussion of who is responsible for what. We saw a case study that used disaggregated payment, which is a bit of the opposite, where stakeholders pay for their own section of the program. Yeah. Which could be easier to manage, but on the other hand, does have some risks. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, I think I can. But does have the risk that some areas of a program could be underfunded in contrast to others. And we saw an example where there was really phased out core payment. So you start off with a core funding, which will decline over time and could be replaced by new investors. So when we look at scaling up a sustainability, we saw that it is a good practice to really start with a core area in which you have an intense intervention, but in doing so already allow for future areas to already be sensitized to spillover, so that when you move outwards, it reduces costs and time significantly. And then regarding sustainability, as I already mentioned, institutionalize your agreements in terms of governance and funding. Build on local public stakeholders. These are the perennial organizations with the right mandate to enforce the program, but also really invest in this cultural change. We are all aware that child labor is a deeply rooted cultural, can be cultural practice, which takes a lot of time to change, but without a good investment in this area, sustainable significant impact will be less. So overall, what we then see as potentials from these cases, we see that a landscape approach is cross-sectoral. We know that child labor does not stop at the borders of a certain supply chain or household. And therefore, this approach really does not leave behind stakeholders that have a risk of using child labor, for example, households in other supply chains, or actors that could perpetuate on child labor that are not included in a program. And of course, cultural change should include an entire area. As I said, forgotten stakeholders could still perpetuate on the use of child labor. So this community element is really important because the community involvement is an integral point as well. It is important to really involve local communities from the beginning, which could really contribute to the relevance and local ownership of these programs. And of course, local knowledge is in that sense included, which might otherwise be forgotten. Then the approach acts holistically. We know that child labor cannot be addressed by focusing on one solution in isolation. And also because these root causes are often connected. And in doing so, by being holistic, the approach can really act as a convener in a certain area, reducing fatigue and really improving the coherence. And then lastly, which we saw more on the side of a landscape approach rather than an integrated area-based approach, is really this connection of two layers in the landscape and the recognition of the effects of climate-related issues to social issues. So, for example, think about how the productivity of a farm or biodiversity can affect income, how water quality can affect income. So that would be the last overall potential, of course, that we saw. Overall, there are a lot more details. It's very difficult to put them all in 15 minutes. So, of course, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them, and I'm looking forward to discuss the rest in the panel discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that comprehensive overview of the report, good practices, challenges, and conclusions. So Lisa shared with us the operational definition of landscape approaches that was used to guide the selection of the case studies, but several other terms are used to describe similar ideas, and you mentioned some of those, Lisa. Gazo, your organization has a lot of experience with child labor-free zones, an approach that is featured in this collection of case studies, and you use the term area-based approach. Could you maybe explain the difference between an area-based approach and a landscape approach?
Thank you, Almudena. Yes, indeed. We have been working with what's more popularly known as area-based approach. And I think the presentation very well captured the similarities, but also the differences point of view, the way we have been implementing, I think I'll start by explaining the essence of the area-based approach, which, as the name suggests, it focuses on a certain geographical area, which could be a district, it could be a small village, it could be a plantation. But the idea is to really focus on the community. So the area-based approach is a very holistic, community-centric approach, which is focused on community participation, child participation, and it targets child labor elimination across the entire geographic area, and even sometimes depending on the scale of the project or scale of the intervention, even the broader region. A very critical point of area-based approach is that instead of addressing individual cases, instead of addressing household cases and focusing solely on the workplaces or supply chain, it focuses on all forms of child labor, addressing all forms of child labor in that area. And the idea really is the idea was to not just focus on a particular sector, but really move from a sectoral or just a supply chain based approach to a more area based approach so that we can prevent children from entering from one sector to another by addressing the root causes of child labor in that particular region. It's really important that all stakeholders, all key stakeholders in that area where you're implementing the area-based approach are actively engaged, their roles are identified, and a lot of times the local leadership also depends on what kind of leadership is influential in the local context. So the local leaders, the district government officials, the civil society organizations, but many times formation of women and youth-led groups also play a really important role in implementing the area-based approach to eradicate child labor. Increasingly, there's also an inclusion of what Lisa mentioned, that when it comes to landscape approaches, now shifting a little bit also towards landscape approaches, is that, of course, the socio-ecological parameters are really important. Issues like deforestation are sometimes at the center of landscape approaches. However, the focus when it comes to area-based approaches really primarily on the socio-economic aspects of child labor with regards to addressing its root causes. Increasingly, however, there are organizations, including our partners in the work that we are doing. The area-based approaches are including integrating many elements that can be seen in landscape approaches, which also means integrating innovative solutions within that particular area where the ABA implementation is taking place. As we know, popularly, child labor-free zones have been synonymous with implementing area-based approach for eradicating child labor. We see examples like integration of livelihood-related projects in area-based approach, especially in the last few years. We see examples of food security, social security, interventions that are cross-cutting with gender-related issues in the community. So it's a very bottom-up combined with a rights-based approach, which really focuses on community participation and eventually the ownership, the handover of when a child labor-free zone is declared, and of course that's a really long process, and probably parts of it will come up today in the conversation. But eventually, the idea really is to hand over when a zone is declared child labor-free, to hand over the ownership to the community, but also keep on strengthening the accountability with regards to ownership from other stakeholders and duty bearers, such as the governments involved in that area, and also now increasing participation from the private sector. Yeah, so taking a pause here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Gazel. And staying on this topic of definitions, Billy, in your opinion, how important are the different terms we use to describe often very similar approaches?
Yeah, thank you. Well, and I think, and Gazel's just done a great job of explaining a lot of the benefits of area-based and landscape approaches. But I think the main focus obviously is and should be the impact of the work being done, but understanding if, how and why an approach or combination of approaches has been effective is important. And I think that's where having clear definitions can really help, that provide a common language to better understand the effectiveness and share learning that can then benefit future work, and understanding what approach is going to be the best to use in a given context is really the value there. With this in mind, actually, we've been recently doing some work jointly as part of the network of about 20 landscape and jurisdictional practitioners I mentioned, to define core criteria for a mature landscape initiative that would really hopefully help understand the different aspects involved and what is needed to create the most effective, I guess, landscape initiative in any given context.
Great, thank you very much, Billy. And actually, when we look at the interventions that were planned or delivered by the case studies that were analyzed, we saw that no fundamentally new types of intervention emerged that was unique to a landscape approach. Lisa, during the data collection phase, you interviewed different stakeholders involved in the case studies. Many were very enthusiastic about this new way of working. Why do you think the idea has gained so much traction with different stakeholder groups?
Yeah, so looking at different stakeholder groups, let's start with people that we've interviewed representing local communities. I think for them, what we've often heard is that, well, first of all, working under the umbrella and really convening and collaborating together for them reduces the amount of programs they're involved in. But also by really implementing this bottom up, it allows for them to decide on their own future, which I think oftentimes, if we look at traditional, more conservative programs, could have often been an element that is forgotten, really involve these local communities from the start. Which then also for them improves the way to which a program is relevant for them, and therefore also improves the way in which they are willing to contribute, looking really at this local ownership element. And then I think from a research perspective, it really, really addresses the complexity of certain issues. For example, instead of saying, we know, of course, if we look at child labor, of course, we know that in short term, if you help people with an improving income, this will address child labor to some extent. But if you really look at having an effect on child labor over the long run, you really need to recognize how complex these issues are, and really need to recognize that it is not only related to the household as a unit. You need to involve multiple levels of a society. So because of this, I think, and the landscape approach really takes these issues seriously, which is why, from a research perspective, it gains so much attraction, I would say. Yeah, I'm taking a pause here.
Great, thank you so much for that. And maybe moving on to Prince, in your experience of landscape approaches, especially in Ghana, are there any particular types of interventions that are better suited to this type of approach?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, with the landscape approach, there are some particular interventions that help in this kind of collaborative approach. And again, that intervention would have to be developed and implemented together with the landscape partners also. So a typical example in Ghana in this case is setting up community child protection committees and then training the community child protection committees. As Lisa mentioned earlier on that you have to leverage on the existing structures at the community level and making use of the local people also to support in the implementation of the landscape approach. So where you work with the all partners in the landscape to set up this structure, it helps in a way of supporting the approach of the landscape and in achieving the objective of the landscape approach. Another intervention is also joint awareness raising or joint educational campaign within the communities, because we have different partners, different stakeholders, players within the landscape. It's better you don't do different organizations don't do different awareness raising in addressing the same enemy, which is the challenge that we are addressing. But if the stakeholders on the landscape conduct awareness raising together in a community, is a way of also reducing the community fatigue and also avoiding the duplication of intervention in the community. So you have to design the intervention in such a way that if 3 or 4 organizations or partners are in the same community, you conduct the awareness raising together so that each partner we fix a date, each partner will have to speak on a particular topic on the same day so that we don't go in different days, different times, and then different messages also to confuse and then disturb the community members. Other intervention that also could also be done as part of the collaborative is also supporting with the capacity building of the landscape partners also as well. But each partner may have certain skills and certain expertise, and there's the need for the landscape partners also to ensure that we are all of the same level of understanding, particularly when it comes to child labor and then the messages that we have to deliver. There are also other thematic areas that other players on the landscape also would need as part of their work to augment what they are doing on the landscape. For instance, how to set up a village savings and loan association, how to conduct issue on gender awareness also as well. So all these can be done, and different partners on the landscape have different capacities, and we can leverage on the capacities of the other partners also to strengthen all the members on the landscape capacity. And then again, and the last one I will talk about is also taking building on the comparative advantages of the various players active on the landscape and how to strengthen the capacity and the quality intervention. So these are the type of activities that or intervention that best suit the collaborative approaches on the landscape. Thank you, and over.
Thank you very much, Prince. And you and both you and Lisa mentioned the importance of collaboration. And to collaborate, there is the need to have coordination structures. And in your presentation, Lisa, we saw that a key challenge that we came across in these case studies was setting up these functioning coordination structures. Can you tell us a bit more about some of the challenges and solutions you saw in relation to this?
Yes. So I think the most important challenge, but which relates to a landscape approach overall, would be planning realistically and really planning over a longer term. For example, the few cases in Ghana that we researched, they've taken 5 years only to convene stakeholders and set up a governance structure, which is very long time if we look at how development programs are set up, right? Usually we know that we would get funding maybe 4-5 years on the program as a whole. So it also really has an impact to how development programs or funding structures are set up. But so when you do have the chance to do this, so hey, you can plan realistically. What did help is to involve a certain neutral broker within this area. For example, because if you have to involve different type of private sector stakeholders, there needs to be a pre-competitive space where they can collaborate in a safe way. But simultaneously, this neutral broker needs to make sure that the needs and interests of people with less influence of a large corporation, I would say, are represented to the same extent, so that there would still be some equality in decision making. Yeah, and what we also saw is that because there are so many different type of stakeholders within an area, we saw what really worked well for them is clustering certain groups together. So you can group a certain community, and then maybe what we also know maybe from other jurisdictional systems, but really clustering people together from communities to a little bit larger area, maybe link a few communities together and work your way up, so that there's really a structured way also for communication, but also for decision making. Yeah, these are just a few examples, but overall I think the complex will always remain challenging, but it really requires long-term planning, plan realistically, but also budget realistically. Yeah, and I guess that still also needs a few changes to make that work. Thanks.
Thanks, Lisa. And Prince, to go back to you from your experience in Ghana, can you maybe share some insights on what makes an effective coordination structure?
Thank you. So what will help make effective coordinating structure? Because landscape approach, you are dealing with different partners and different stakeholders. One, we need to have a good and quality staff who will do the proper coordination at the landscape level, both at the national level and also at the operational level. Because if you don't have someone who has the skills of coordination and the skill of organizing, it will not really work. And again, one also would have to ensure that when you are setting up a landscape project, you need to do a lot of background work and then a lot of engagement. Engagement with the stakeholders at the national level, the government stakeholders, the private sector, the civil society, and then all other players, even industry members who are operating on the landscape. Because you want everybody to come on board on the landscape program and then address the issue on the landscape. So we need to do a lot of engagement to have their buy-in, awareness raising, explaining the objective of the project, objective of the landscape, and how it will benefit everybody, particularly to avoid the duplication of resources and the effort that we are all want to avoid. And also implementing things in SAROs, because when we are implementing program in SAROs, the impact is not good as we expect if you have all other partners working together to do that one. So again, that kind of engagement and awareness raising is key in addressing the in addressing the issue of in the implementing the landscape. Another other one is the governance structure, as Lisa mentioned earlier on, or other speakers are also have mentioned. We need to set up a governance structure. The governance structure, both at the operational level of the landscape, which in this case could be the district level, and also at the national level. Because landscape activities mostly happen at the operational level, which is the district level. So you need the district level structure to move the landscape activities. And you also need the national level structure to have an oversight role of what is happening at the district, and setting up the governance structure will have to be led and by an agency, in this case the government agency, who has a mandate in addressing the issue. So in our case, where we have is a child labor issues, is the Ministry of Employment and Labor Relations, who has that mandate to address the issue of child labor. So at the national level, they are the leaders, they are taking the leadership role in the national level structure. And at the district level structure, governance structure, or the operational level, is there also the Department of Social Welfare and Community Development, who is also taking the leadership role of the operational level structure. And again, when setting up these structures, you have to leverage on the existing structures. existing stakeholders who have the mandate and capacity to manage and then address the issue of child labor. So in our case in Ghana, there's already existing at district level, we have a district child protection committees who have some kind of responsibility in addressing the child labor in their respective district. So we leverage on this existing structure and strengthen them to bring them together again, and then added the landscape approach. We are implementing their role and mandate also to them, so they are leading the mandate. But of course, the secretariat is the Department of Social Welfare and Community Development, who play the secretariat role in addressing all the issue of the landscape. Because again, we have different stakeholders: the civil society, the NGO, the industry, the government, and all those people are part of it. And then having this structure set up, of course, there's also how to have a clear terms of reference for these structures, both at the national level and then district, so that we have a clear focus and so that they have a clear mandate of what they are doing to address the issue on the landscape and how they are coordinating. Because in our case, we are not having projects where we are implementing in the communities. It is various stakeholders, partners working in the district who have the project and activities in the communities. So we are supporting the coordination of all these stakeholders, ensuring that they have effective system in place and to address the issue of child labor and child protection also as well. So we have stakeholders whose interest is on education, others' interest is on health, others' interest is on general child protection, and other interest is also on the child labor issue. So these are all the stakeholders that we have brought on board, and we are coordinating their intervention, their approaches in the various landscape landscape districts. And again, we need also to strengthen their capacity to have effective coordinating structure. You need to strengthen their capacity. Capacity in terms of the knowledge of the subject matter you are dealing with and the problem you are dealing with. And also the secretariat, which is the leading the landscape approach at the district level. And in Ghana, as I mentioned, the Department of Social Welfare, who have inadequate resources to do their operation and their activities. We need also to strengthen their capacity in terms of logistics to be able to do the effective coordination of all partners or all players on the landscape And because we are also dealing with multiple and stakeholders, we need someone who to have a good facilitation skills to coordinate even the meeting, where people they have different views and the different approaches. We need someone with a good facilitation skill to to be able to coordinate the meetings over there. The one thing also we have done so far is to set up a WhatsApp platform. So all the partners on the landscape, we have one common platform where we used to exchange information and then to use to update members on what is also going on the landscape. So these are the things that we need to do in order to have effective governance structure on the landscape. And the last one is we require a strong leadership to lead it. We need someone who have the passion and have the kind of leadership quality also to do it. Thank you very much, and over.
Thank you very much, Prince, for that very comprehensive answer. Maybe looking into the impact of the landscape approaches to tackle child labor, which was one of the key questions that we tried to answer in this review of case studies. Unfortunately, there wasn't much evidence of impact, and this was due to several reasons that Lisa already mentioned, including the limited maturity of some of the examples and also limited attempts to monitor and evaluate the impact in such vast landscape areas. Gazel, of course, the case studies in ICI's report are not exhaustive. Can you tell us about other examples of either landscape or area-based approaches that did have a measurable impact on reducing child labor? What can we learn from these examples?
Thank you. Yes. So I think to begin with, I'd like to start by saying that, we're living in times where we need to also reassess our understanding of impact a little bit. So a lot of times the impact may not be measurable quantitatively, but we do have, in the end, these interventions are supposed to change human lives and lived experiences, and that's where impact can be understood best from. And having said that, I think what really worked, where we have success stories of area-based approach working, why it worked is because there were integrated, innovative approaches. And one of the examples that I'd like to give where we did have measurable impact is from Bangladesh. We have a project which is a continued project post COVID. It's called the Resource Project, and we identified the shrimp sector as a critical sector because that has really hazardous forms of work for children. So our idea has been to focus on the workers who are in shrimp fry collection at the bottom of supply chain. But that area and Bangladesh being a very vulnerable coastline because of the climate crisis and continued cyclones, also presents a very great challenge in terms of its landscape, in terms of the quality of land and to what extent it can offer people the support to have livelihoods. So to address child labor in that area, we had to also adapt the area-based approach from livelihood point of view. And that livelihood had to be very relevant and affordable and had to build capacity of the shrimp catching, the shrimp fry catching households. So we implemented a pilot with 40 households. That's how that project started, and our implementing partner has been Cordate, which has been designing this intervention called saline farming. It started as Salt Solution, which is a larger approach to address the salt content in the land in that area, so that salt tolerant fruits and vegetables can be grown by the community, and the food that is grown by giving them this capacity, the income from there helps these households to send their children back to school. So this was primarily a very important part of the area-based approach, despite besides following all other steps of an area-based approach, which is to set up a child labor monitoring system, which is to build the capacity and awareness on child labor issues in that area. But we could not have ignored the issue of food security, the challenge that was there. And by combining livelihood, by combining food security, and by linking it with education in that area, we were able to. So we had 73.68% children who were out of school in these households when we intervened in that area who came back to school. So that's the number that we were able to achieve in the pilot in bringing the children back to school. There was 100% increase in the income amongst these households by growing and selling fruits and vegetables that were the salt that were grown as a result of saline farming capacity building. So that is one of the examples, and based on the success of this model of this pilot, we have now scaled up this intervention in a more vulnerable area of the same region, where we are working with more than 150 households in the region and scaling up the same area-based approach. Another example that can be shared is a similar example from Uganda, where we are implementing Seeds for Education, which also combines the issue of food security, but issue of smallholder farmers' income in the coffee sector, because that's where the problem is, where we are trying to address child labor in Mount Elgin region. And the point here is that measurable impact in area-based approaches, in landscape approaches, is very challenging. But also, in order to have the impact, really designing the intervention that suits the community needs and is beyond just monitoring of child labor is really, really important. So I think that's how it really worked in these two cases for us. That's why we are able to have some kind of measurable impact. Yeah, and happy to keep talking more about it, but I think I'm going to stop for other panelists. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing those innovative projects. Maybe turning to Billy. As you mentioned, ISO has recently published a series of papers on measuring the impact of landscape approaches and guiding companies on how to claim impacts achieved by such approaches. Can you tell us more about what needs to be considered from the start, from the design phase?
Yeah, thank you. And I think Gaza just did a great job of summarizing kind of the key things to be thinking about in terms of measuring impact. So what ICO have recently done is, again, working with this kind of collective group of landscape and jurisdictional practitioners, look at kind of some of the key aspects around monitoring and for the types of claims that companies might want to be making as part of a landscape and jurisdictional approach initiative. So the key elements that we discussed was having a collective monitoring framework set up from the start, and that should really align with the kind of collective goals and intentions of the whole group working on it. So very much, as Gazel said, in terms of really understanding from the community and collectively for the region what is most important to be done in that area. And based on really the impact that you are trying to make, then establishing, what are the kind of the baselines there, what are the indicators that you want to be monitoring, and having that structure kind of set up in place. Which also links to maybe what you want to be communicating about the work that you are doing and the impact that you are making. If you don't have the effective monitoring set up, then you can't make the claims at the end of it that would relate to that impact. So really the papers that we had was just to kind of highlight the key considerations if you do want to be making claims either about the actions that you're taking at a landscape level or about the contributions that you might be making to landscape level outcomes.
Great, thank you so much. And we're slowly arriving to the end of our panel, but I would like to just take a couple of moments to discuss the implications of the findings of this report to other landscape scale programs. Gazel, in your view, what needs to change for future landscape scale programs to result in greater impact on child labor?
Yeah, I think that's a long list, but just to be as short and critical as possible, I think it's really important to start with improving the pre-existing structures instead of keep on building new ones. No matter how important innovation is, I think it's really important to first recognize the importance that lies in the power of community resources, which brings me to the second point, that it's if we really want landscape approaches, area-based approaches, and any intervention aimed at community welfare and empowerment, we also need to really think about what we are giving back to the community besides addressing the issue of child labor or livelihood. There's a lot of times the communities feel fatigue. At least that's what we hear from the communities, and they feel that they are not rightfully compensated for their time, which does impact coordination, monitoring, sustainability, ownership. So that kind of incentive really needs to be there. Thirdly, when we are talking about monitoring of impact or progress, or as simple as monitoring and remediation of child labor in landscape or area-based approaches, having that is really important in the first place, and B, to really understand how those monitoring systems are designed to fit whose interest and primarily targeting what kind of issues. I think that's really important. And lastly, because our concern again and again has been coming, that how do we measure impact? The case studies are not exhaustive. It's possible to do that, I think, with critical partnerships with academia, with research institutions, with people who are engaged in thought leadership. So with that kind of partnership, it's possible to measure impact, I think, and these are definitely the top 4 or 5 points that I think can play a really important role in improving the impact of landscape or area-based approaches.
Great, thank you so much. And Billy, looking at other issues, is this a challenge? The measuring impact, is that a challenge only related to child labor specifically, or do you see that we struggle to measure impact of landscape approaches on other issues? Is there anything that we can learn from efforts elsewhere?
Yeah, thanks. And I think, the nature and the ambition of a landscape and jurisdictional approach does mean that it is complex to measure impact. So both the scale at which we're operating and finding appropriate levels of data to kind of manage that. You might find that there's secondary data sources at a national level, but maybe not at the kind of region that you are particularly covering from the area or landscape-based approach. Also, the multi-stakeholder nature of a landscape approach can make it hard to really tie back what different interventions maybe has led to the change that is being made. So it's definitely not just child labour. That said, there are some aspects of kind of measuring social issues which I think have additional challenges at landscape level. Some monitoring, for example, land use change, where you can use kind of GIS maps to set at the right level to see that change, can make those things easier. And I think there's less reliance on secondary data when you're looking at social issues. So there's more of a cost factor in terms of setting up the effective monitoring and understanding of what the challenges are that's potentially there as well. But setting up this collective monitoring framework from the start and being able to kind of put in place those processes is, I think, the bit that's really key. And what we heard in, I think, the reports and from a lot of the panelists today is that, the nature of some of the initiatives that have been looked at haven't yet reached a point of maturity where we can effectively measure what that impact might be. So I think there's a big case for watching this space and seeing how this evolves in those initiatives as well.
Great, thank you so much. And maybe before we open the floor for discussions, one last question to Lisa. What do you think are the elements of landscape approach that are most promising? Are there any areas that require further work?
So I think overall within the potentials, it requires work because there needs to be a structural change in which we address these issues. Gazel also already mentioned it. You need to look at these structures even that exist before you start implementing or designing a program. Think about what I said. If we look at financial management, a lot of funding is now based on only 5 years. Which of course is way too short if you want to really implement an effective program. So this structural way of thinking, really from going from long-term to long-term, from short-term to long-term, I would say is something that really needs to change. But overall, if we look at the potentials, I think there are so many actually. So had the way in which it allows to convene these stakeholders within an area to really solve this issue of what Gazel also said, the fatigue amongst local communities, but also instead of reinventing the wheel every time someone new comes in, why not build on existing initiatives and leverage on each other? I think is a really, really promising element of a landscape approach. But that, of course, also touches upon the way in which we intervene. So be holistic, allow for both direct as indirect influences to be targeted. As Prisons mentioned, you have health elements, you have social protection elements, you even have water management, infrastructure, so many instances that are affecting child labor directly and indirectly, which I think are through this approach more allowed to be addressed. I think these are the biggest that I would keep it on now. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you so much. And of course, people can always refer to the report to look into these topics in more detail. So now I would like to invite participants to raise their hands to ask questions. Please don't be shy. We are very eager to hear your questions, so you can use the raise your hand functionality on Teams, and we will be able to unmute you. But maybe in the meantime, while people get the courage to raise their hands, I can start asking some of the questions that came in through the chat. There was one question regarding claims that companies could make about their contributions to the landscape. So Peter would like to know if you, Billy, maybe could be more specific regarding the claims that companies can make.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for the question, Perry. So I think there's a range of claims that companies could make around their involvement in a landscape and jurisdictional approach, and that can come from the kind of collective perspective. So you are part of this kind of landscape and jurisdictional approach initiative that is, working area, and that is creating a certain amount of impact, or even just at that earlier stage. So whether it's at you're making kind of a collective commitment, you're making the different actions maybe that you're taking as a collective, or then looking more at the kind of performance of the initiative and the impact that's being made. It is because, I guess, of the scale and the nature of a landscape and jurisdictional approach, it's much harder to make an attribution style claim, i.e. we have done this that resulted in this kind of response from it. It's far easier to be talking more on the contribution that you have made to a change. And so what we kind of focused on is, actually, if you're talking about contribution as a company, what can you say collectively, which is going to be probably the most kind of effective way to talk about the role that you are playing. But in some cases, actually may not kind of fit the needs of the organization. So if you have kind of, maybe just a report internally that you're trying to do, you might want to not just be saying, all right, as part of a collective we did this, but actually what was our contribution. So we also talk about proportional contribution claims and how that could be applied in different contexts. And that works, I guess, easiest from the type of financial model Lisa described, where maybe companies are putting into a pooled like amount. Maybe it's kind of clear the different investments that are made, and therefore if you are seeing an improvement, sorry, all my examples are in kind of hectares in my head rather than in child labour terms, but if you're making a kind of impact on restoring, say, collectively 50,000 hectares with 5 companies that have all been part of this initiative, and so then you may be able to say individually, okay, we've proportionally supported this restoration of 10,000 hectares. So it's that kind of conversation and kind of positions that we are putting out in terms of the different types of claims that maybe companies could be making in relation to landscape and jurisdictional approaches.
Great, thank you so much.
I'll share the link.
Really, perfect. And another question that came in through the chat is, how long do you think it will take to see impact? Maybe Gazel, from your experience implementing area-based approaches, do you have any insights on this?
Yeah, I think it's you need to give time to measure impact. So of course you follow the basics, you do a baseline and then you do an end line. But like I said, the context and the design of the project intervention matters a lot. So while you may not be able to measure an absolute impact from beginning until the end, it's always good to have intermediate outcome assessment or impact assessment. So that's definitely one thing. But any child labor free zone or area-based approach intervention takes minimum 3 to 5 years to settle and then to kick off and to start showing results. So unfortunately, it is a process, and therefore it takes time. So we have to give it that much time, but also understand that complex problems will have complex solutions, and therefore you cannot hurry them. And really, instead of wanting them to adapt to time and take less time, or why is impact not happening, I think the other way also is really important, that the other parties also slightly change the way they see, like I said, right? Slightly change the way and be a little bit more, just wait for the impact, but really believe in the process. Because even though we don't have a lot of quantitative evidence, we do have evidence enough that these are definitely the two approaches which have a lot of potential, based on the case studies, but also based on the kind of layers, and that it very well addresses the complexities in the way that it establishes structures, has a lot of room to invite more innovation, and most importantly, to really hand over the ownership to where it belongs. So really, and I think for companies, governments being more open, and they already are. There are many examples where companies are investing, especially in the cocoa sector. We are working with some companies in the coffee sector. So it's definitely there, but just keep that in mind, that it will take that much time.
Thank you very much for that. And there have been a couple of questions regarding new legislation, like, for example, the CSDDD in the European Union. So a couple of participants wanted to know whether the landscape approaches could be considered compliant with these regulations. Billy, maybe you can have a go at answering this question.
I can have a go. I think there's a bit of an implied connotation there, but yeah. So I think there's definitely an opportunity for landscape and jurisdictional approaches and how they can maybe address some of the issues, particularly the large-scale systemic issues on a regional basis that could be causing concerns, I guess, from some of the regulation positions. I think compliant is maybe a strong word to use. It becomes so context specific, and I'm certainly not familiar enough to be able to kind of go down that route, or the context side. But I definitely think once we're to understand, and maybe actually this is a good question in terms of the area-based work on child labour as well. But I think there is really an opportunity with trying to address these issues, having the framework in place to be able to tackle it. I think a lot of the due diligence style kind of focus really is on what you have set up to be able to kind of manage the scenario, as much as kind of incidences that come up in place. So I think, yeah, there is definitely an opportunity to be better placed, I guess, to deal with those challenges.
Thank you. And then I see that there is a conversation going on the chat regarding an example of duplicity of structures in Ghana and how those can be coordinated in a better way. So there was one comment saying that they encountered a case in Ghana where there were two community child community protection committees that were operating in the same community, that had been initiated by different partners. So the participant wanted to know how we would deal with such a case. Maybe Prince, do you want to share your thoughts?
Yes. Yes. So where there are multiple CCPCs in a community, the district coordinating committee handled that case. So the district coordinating committee organized monthly meeting. So this is discussed at the monthly meeting section, and the partners involved in setting up those CCPCs are part of it. So what happened is that at the end of the discussions, the partners would agree to merge the CCPCs. And apparently, where they form the CCPCs, you could see that the same members are in these two CCPs or three CCPCs. You could, because the structure of the CCPC is such that you need somebody from the chief, somebody who is a unit committee member, a woman representative, and you find the same people representing 2 or 3 CCPCs. So basically, the district coordinating committee are able to bring these partners together to merge the CCPCs, and we have only one CCPC in the community. So in the landscape where we had this problem, now all these have been resolved, and we have one CCPC per community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to encourage other participants to raise their hands and ask more questions. Maybe in the meantime, there was another question regarding forced labor and whether landscape approaches could make it easier to address such a challenge that we face in the cocoa sector. Maybe Prince, you can have a go at answering this question.
Quick one. Can you repeat the question for me?
Yeah,
I lost
sorry.
you.
So do you think landscape approaches make it easier to address forced labor in the cocoa sector?
Okay, thank you.
Would there be
So,
a potential?
yeah, there's potential for landscape approach to address child labor. If any partner has a child labor intervention within the landscape, the landscape approach is a good place to address it, because basically when within the landscape, partners are working together and they are addressing the issue together. And where the partner has a project on the landscape, it's also discussed even at the district coordinating level meeting, and all parties or partners who also have a similar intervention also come on board to support it. So indeed, landscape approach has a great potential in addressing the issue of forced labor. As in terms of the awareness raising, we can get other partners who also can also support in the awareness raising. In terms of the setting up grievance committee also within the landscape, within the communities, you can get other partners who can also support you to set up a grievance committees within the community to address the forced labor issue. So indeed, it has potential of addressing the forced labor. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I see no other questions in the chat. Megan, would you like to go ahead?
Sorry, no, but I can see a question from Tomoko. And there is a raised hand from Sarah afterwards as well.
Great. Okay, indeed, I see the question from Tomoko. So Tomoko is saying that we have been working with the government of Ghana to develop and implement child labor free zone guidelines that were issued in 2020 and revised in 2023. And now they're implementing a new child labor free zone project in Ghana. I'm not sure.
Actually, it was a more recent question, which is down at the bottom of the list.
I missed that.
Don't worry. It's asking for a good example of pooled funding by partners contributing in landscape, because I think this was identified as a key good practice to try and have available pooled funds that can be used by all members of a particular landscape. Tell us more, Lisa.
Sure. Yes, so indeed, pooled funding was used in a couple of cases. I will say that this was a very young case, so they were just starting to finalize setting up their governance system. But to the people that we spoke to, their pooled funding structure allowed participants to contribute proportionately to their capacity without compromising any power of decision making, which then would level out had different sizes of stakeholders within a certain area. Of course, what this would require is solid governance. I also saw a comment coming in which touched upon the pre-competitive space, which is a very valid question. Indeed, in many of these, or in some cases, there are multiple entities operating in the same area, whilst normally you would not be allowed to collaborate too much. So really having a neutral entity that guides different stakeholders through this process and also institutionalizes agreements here is very important. I would say because of the not the maturity, but the lack of maturity within these cases, it is difficult to say if practically afterwards this also still, of course, worked to the extent that they were telling us back then. So.
Great, thank you. Sarah, I believe you had a question.
No, it's fine.
Great. If there are any more questions, maybe we can start wrapping up. Thank you very much to everyone who joined us today, all the participants that asked questions, and of course to our great panelists. Although we see that there's limited impact of landscape approaches, on child labor reduction, we have clearly seen from this discussion that there is potential. The collaboration that landscape approaches offer, as well as the community ownership that helps to the sustainability of the projects, as well as the ability of landscape approaches to address complexities in one same landscape, clearly show the potential of these approaches. However, we see that a lot of work still has to be done. Planning in advance, developing strong monitoring and evaluation frameworks from the start is key, as well as finding innovative ways of monitoring this impact. So I invite all our participants to check out our report, which I will be sharing in the chat, to see good practices, challenges, and recommendations for future landscape approaches. So thank you very much to everyone, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.